dot dash 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 dot dot. I awoke to a chorus of beeps and the taste of metal on my tongue. My throat felt raw, as if I'd swallowed sandpaper. The haze of anesthesia still clung to me, and for a moment I lay still, trying to piece together where I was. Nurse Alvarez hovered by the bedside, her expression cautious. "You're in recovery, Margot. The surgery went as planned. Drive Patel says you're in good shape." "Where are my parents?" I croaked, panic flaring. She looked down, empathy softening her eyes. "They did come back, honey. They arrived just after you went under. They're in the waiting room, and they're asking to see you as soon as you're awake." Relief washed through me, quick and fierce. I closed my eyes and let it linger. They had returned. They hadn't abandoned me. When I opened them again, I saw my mother's face so close, it nearly filled the window of the room's doorway. Her eyes were bright, red-rimmed with tears, and she looked decades older than she had 2 days ago. My father stood behind her, shoulders hunched, guilt etched into the lines of his face. They rushed to my side the moment the curtain was pulled back. My mother grasped my hand, knuckles trembling. "Oh, Margot," she whispered. "We are so sorry." I wanted to lash out, to demand why they'd left me alone. But as I looked into her tear-filled eyes, my anger splintered into something quieter, more brittle. My father cleared his throat. "We got caught up in the shower, and we lost track of time. We tried to be here, darling, we did." It sounded lame even in my head. I drew in a shaky breath and managed. "You chose her party first." My mother's shoulders sagged. "We shouldn't have. We were wrong." They stayed by my side until the doctor came to check my vitals, until they wheeled me to my room, until I drifted into fitful sleep. And through it all, a quiet promise formed in the silence. When I was stronger, I would make them understand the cost of their mistake. The days that followed were a blur of physical therapy, pain medications, and endless paperwork. My hospital room became a revolving door of family members, offering forced smiles and apologies. Celeste never visited. She sent a bouquet of peonies with a note that said, "So sorry you're not here to celebrate with us. Love, C." The cost of my surgery arrived in the mail 2 weeks later, an itemized statement nearly as thick as a novel. 6-figure tallies of surgeon fees, hospital stays, anesthesia, and follow-up consultations. Each line a reminder that my very body had a price tag. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands. My parents flanked me, their faces drawn. My father finally spoke. Your sister wants to help with the bills." My chest tightened. Help, as if she hadn't already taken so much. The air in the room felt brittle, like fine china about to shatter. I didn't answer. I just looked at them, and in that heavy moment, the scale of everything that had happened finally settled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The letter stayed on my kitchen table for days, its corners curling from where I kept pressing it flat with trembling hands. Every time I looked at it, I felt the same wave of heat flush my neck. The apartment around me smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the dull sweetness of wilting flowers. Balloons from well-meaning neighbors had deflated in corners, their once cheerful messages sagging in silence. My incision ached every time I laughed, coughed, or shifted too fast, a constant reminder that healing had a cost. Mom called every morning now, as if each apology could erase the fact that they'd chosen pastels and party favors over my open abdomen on a cold operating table. Dad dropped by with plastic containers of soup, his eyes drifting around the apartment, never quite landing on mine. They brought receipts, bills, promises, to figure it out. But their eyes always drifted to that thick stack of medical charges. I left on the counter like a weapon. "Margot, honey," Mom said one Tuesday morning. She perched on the edge of my couch, a mug of peppermint tea cooling untouched in her hands. "Your sister, Celeste, she and Peter they're willing to help pay some of this. They have the baby coming. But they know this is a lot for you alone." "A lot for me alone?" I repeated, my voice thin and dangerous. "Mom, you realize I didn't invite this, right? It wasn't a shopping spree. It's my life." She flinched as if I'd struck her. I instantly hated how much satisfaction that gave me. But I didn't back down. "I can't do this, Mom," I whispered. "I can't keep pretending it's fine." "We'll help, Margot," she said quickly, reaching for my hand. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart. We've taken a second mortgage on the house. Your father's cashing out some of his retirement early. We just need you to sign a few things to make the payments work." The knot in my throat turned to stone. You want me to sign for your second mortgage? It'll be in your name too, she said, voice bright with forced optimism. It'll protect you in case. Protect me? I laughed, and the pain flared so sharp in my side that I had to press a pillow against my ribs. How convenient! The baby shower was still all over Celeste's social media. I'd muted her posts, but mutual friends still tagged me in photos. My parents beaming beside her 3-tier cake shaped like a diaper bag, pastel confetti raining down around them like absolution. In every photo their faces were aglow, the pride unmistakable. I wondered if they'd smiled like that when the anesthesiologist asked where they were, or when my hand searched for theirs and found only empty air. I didn't sign the papers that week. Or the next. When Celeste finally called, her tone was all syrup and strained concern. Hey Margot, she crooned, stretching my name like an old rubber band. Just wanted to check in. Peter and I feel awful you're dealing with this all alone. You know I'd be there, but third trimester, you know. Do you know, I asked, voice calm as still water, that they left me alone the morning of my surgery? She paused. I could practically hear her teeth clench. It was important to us. We planned that shower for months. So you do know. Silence thickened the line. Finally, she said, well, anyway. Peter's got some contacts with a billing advocate. He thinks they can negotiate the total down if you're willing to sign a few things. I'd really appreciate it. You know, for the family? For the family, I ended the call without saying goodbye. I sat on my bed until the sky outside the window turned from peach to violet, my hands pressed tight over the fresh scar beneath my ribs. A week later, the phone rang again. This time it was my father, his voice trembling the way it used to when he'd scold me for staying out past curfew. Margot, please, he said, you're making this harder than it has to be. Just sign the mortgage agreement. We can't carry it alone. You didn't carry me when I needed you, I said. Why should I carry you now? The silence was colder than any winter wind. That night, I spread every bill out across my kitchen table. Line after line of medical codes, test fees, hourly rates for people who'd sliced me open to save my life. I ran my fingers over the grand total. 6 figures. 6 figures for a chance to keep breathing. And they wanted me to sign my name over to them like a sacrifice at the altar of Celeste's perfect life. I closed my eyes and saw my mother's tear-bright eyes by my recovery bed, my father's hunched shoulders, Celeste's perfect baby bump framed by champagne flutes and pastel cupcakes. I made a decision. The next day, when they came by with the papers, I didn't let them inside. I stood in the doorway, my robe pulled tight around my still-healing scar, my hair scraped back from my pale face. No, I said. I'm not signing. It was strange, the way silence could be so loud. After I shut the door in their faces, my apartment felt cavernous. The hum of my fridge, the faint tick of the hallway clock, the occasional hiss from the radiator, each sound felt magnified against the absence of their voices. I spent the next week in a kind of suspended reality. Between follow-up doctor visits, gentle walks around the block, and the daily ritual of sorting through bills I still hadn't paid, I tried to pretend I didn't care, but I did. Of course I did. Each morning I'd stare at my phone, at the texts from mom that had gone from guilt to pleading to passive-aggressive sighs of "we'll talk when you're ready to be reasonable." Dad's messages were more direct. We raised you better than this. Don't do something you'll regret. Family means sacrifice. Sacrifice. The word tasted like iron. I thought back to every time they'd said that before, when I had given up a summer internship to stay home with Celeste, after she broke her leg in college. When I skipped a gap year to help Dad sort out the mess after his small business nearly folded. When I sent half my grad school savings to help Mom cover credit card debt she'd hidden from him. Each time it was for the family. Now I was family too, wasn't I? Or maybe I wasn't the right kind of family. Maybe my survival was less festive than pastel cupcakes and a diaper raffle. It wasn't all bitterness though. In the moments when the pain in my side was quiet enough, I felt something else rising in me, a stubborn seed of defiance. For the first time in my adult life, I realized how fragile their power over me really was. They'd asked me to shoulder something they were too ashamed to carry themselves. And I'd said no. I had no idea what saying no would mean. But the quiet was my answer, for now. One Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived from the hospital billing department. Not a bill this time, a final notice. Pay up, or collections would come knocking. My heart tripped over itself as I read the cold lines. The zeros blurred until they were just shapes on the page. I stared at my bank account that night. I did the math over and over. My job's sick leave pay had already run out. I was still weeks away from being strong enough to go back to my editing shifts. I could drain my savings and still come up short, or worse, end up right back where I started, only more alone. But I refused to call them. I refused to dial my mother's number and beg. The image of them at that shower, confetti in their hair, laughing while I lay under cold lights. No, never again. That same night, an unexpected knock at my door startled me. I peeked through the peephole. Celeste. She stood there in a fitted trench coat, one hand resting on her belly like a prop she didn't quite know how to hold. Her smile was stiff. Margot? I opened the door just enough to see her fully. What do you want, Celeste? To talk. I let her in, but I didn't offer tea. She perched on the same couch where Mom had sat with her cooling mug, and for a moment it felt like a replay of a scene I never wanted to live again. She launched straight in. Look, Peter and I want to help. But you've made it really hard, you know that? Mom and Dad are stressed. They can't handle this on their own. And you know they've always been there for us. Us? I snapped. You mean you? She rolled her eyes, one hand rubbing her belly like she was calming herself. It's always about you, isn't it? You've always been dramatic, Margot. This was supposed to be my time. I barked a humorless laugh. Your time? While I was under the knife? She ignored that. Peter says we can give you a loan. He has a friend who'll draw up the paperwork. It's a good deal, Margot. You sign, we co-sign, everyone wins. I stared at her. A loan. Yes, she said brightly. You get the money, we keep the house safe, and the family doesn't get dragged through court. It's practical. The word practical made me want to scream. No, I said simply. Celeste's face pinched. Don't be selfish. Selfish? I stood feeling the fresh stitches twinge under my robe. You want me to shoulder your debt. You want me to sign my name over to a problem you created. You left me alone when I needed you. And now you want my help? She stood too, eyes flashing. You're acting like a martyr. You think you're so much better than everyone else? You think you're the victim here? I am, I said quietly. I survived. And you can't stand it because I didn't die and let you keep being the center of the world. Celeste's eyes narrowed. If you don't do this, Mom and Dad could lose the house. Then they shouldn't have chosen balloons over me. She stared at me for a moment that felt endless. Then she picked up her purse, adjusted her coat, and left without another word. I watched her walk down the hall through the peephole until she disappeared into the elevator. My knees trembled, but I didn't cry. I turned back to the kitchen table. The bills were still there, scattered like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. I sat down, pulled out my laptop, and started typing. If they wouldn't help me, then I'd help myself. I posted my story online, anonymously at first. A detailed account of what had happened. The sudden diagnosis, the surgery, the party, the abandonment, the debt. I posted every number, every cold fact, every line of the bill. I didn't paint myself as a hero or them as monsters. I just told the truth. I didn't expect anyone to care. But people did. Comments poured in, strangers, friends I hadn't spoken to in years, old college classmates. Some offered advice, some offered leads on patient advocacy groups, and some simply said, "You didn't deserve this." The next day, a friend set up a fundraiser page. I was mortified, but as the donations trickled in, $5 here, 20 there, my shame was swallowed by something brighter. I wasn't alone, not completely. I glanced at my phone when it buzzed again. A text from Mom. Call me. We need to talk about this public nonsense. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched the donations tick upward, a new kind of confetti, one that meant survival on my own terms. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my palm against the tender scar on my side. I would survive this too. The morning after the fundraiser went live, I woke up to sunlight streaming through my half-open curtains and my phone vibrating itself off the nightstand. I caught it before it crashed to the floor. 40 new notifications, messages, comments, a few missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. For a moment, I lay there, tangled in my blanket, trying to remember what normal used to feel like. What did I used to worry about? Deadlines? Overdue library books? A missed hair appointment? Now my life was bills and scars and strangers sending $5 with messages like, "Stay strong, Margot." I should have felt grateful, and I did. But beneath the gratitude, I felt raw, exposed. My story was out there now, stripped bare for anyone to pick apart. The tiny voice in my head kept whispering, "They'll twist it. They'll call you ungrateful. They'll say you're making it up." But when I opened my laptop and scrolled through the comments, something unexpected happened. I didn't see mockery. I saw people, real people. Some had stories worse than mine. Diagnosis missed until it was too late. Medical debt that never got paid off. Family rifts that never healed. Each comment made me feel a little less alone. A little more sure that standing up to them had been the only choice I had left. I was halfway through reading another message. Asterisk, "Hey Margot, I know a lawyer who handles medical debt cases pro bono," when my phone rang again. Mom. I didn't answer. It rang again. Dad. Then Celeste. Then Mom again. Finally, I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, a knock at my door. Not frantic, not polite. Insistent. I stood frozen in my kitchen. The kettle whistled on the stove behind me, forgotten. The knock came again. I opened the door. Mom and Dad stood there, bundled in their winter coats, like they'd rushed straight from the car. Dad's mouth was tight, the way it used to get when he'd caught me sneaking in past curfew. Mom looked exhausted, her eyes puffy, her lipstick smudged like she'd been biting her lips all the way over. "Margot?" Mom started, stepping forward like she might push past me into my living room. I didn't move. "We need to talk," Dad said. "I've said what I needed to say," I replied, my voice calmer than I felt. "Not like this," Dad snapped. "Not dragging this family's name through the mud for a bunch of strangers to gawk at. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I told the truth," I said. "The truth you didn't want people to know." Mom tried to soften it. "Margot, please, we didn't abandon you. You know that. We had Celeste shower, but we were always going to come back. You weren't here when they put me under. You weren't here when I woke up," I said. "You left." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I saw the words dying in her throat, excuses that had withered under the weight of the truth. Dad leaned in, his voice low. "Take that post down. Shut down the fundraiser. This family handles things privately. We don't air dirty laundry for the world to see." I wanted to laugh. Handle things privately? Like pretending everything's fine until someone else pays the price? Mom's eyes glistened. "We're not the villains you're making us out to be." "You're not villains," I said, my voice catching on something sharp inside me. "But you're not heroes either." For a moment, no one spoke. The air between us was thick with every word we'd ever swallowed, every apology that never came. Dad broke first. "We're trying to fix this. But you're making it impossible." "No," I said. "You're trying to fix it so you don't look bad. There's a difference." They left soon after, Mom's shoulders shaking as she walked down the hall, Dad's boots echoing on the stairs. I closed the door and sank to the floor, pressing my back against the cool wood. My phone buzzed again. Another donation notification. I set it face down on the rug. I didn't want to see it. Not right now. ... The next week was a blur of small victories and bigger fears. A local news blogger messaged me, asking if I'd do an interview. I said no. The fundraiser kept growing. Small amounts, but steady. A neighbor slipped an envelope under my door with $50 and a note. No one should have to fight alone. Every bit helped. But so did every new idea. I scribbled on a legal pad at 2 a.m., ways to negotiate my bill, calls to local patient advocates, maybe even getting a lawyer. I learned more about medical billing in those nights than I'd ever wanted to know. One afternoon, I sat in the hospital lobby, waiting to speak with the billing supervisor. I watched families come and go. Mothers pushing strollers, older couples holding hands, a teenage girl reading a paperback, while her father filled out forms. All of them looked so normal, so unaware of how fast everything could fall apart. When they called my name, I squared my shoulders and walked to the glass window. The supervisor, woman named Dana, had kind eyes and a crisp blouse that looked out of place behind the bulletproof glass. "I'm so sorry you're dealing with this alone," she said after I'd explained everything, my voice shaking, my hands gripping the edge of her desk. "You'd be surprised how many people don't know they can negotiate these charges. Let's see what we can do, okay?" Her fingers flew across her keyboard, clicking through line after line. "This test was coded wrong. That anesthesia fee looks doubled. And here," she pointed to a line that might as well have been in Greek to me. "This should never have been out of pocket." By the time I left her office, my debt wasn't gone. But it was smaller. Manageable. Something I could chip away at without selling my soul. Outside, I sat on a bench, the winter sun on my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of warmth that wasn't just the dull burn of my healing scar. Mom's last text that night was short. "You don't know what you're doing. You're going to regret this." Mama, I looked at the message for a long time. Then I deleted it. I would regret plenty in this life. But not this. Not reclaiming the pieces of myself they'd spent so long telling me to sacrifice for everyone else. I closed my eyes and let the quiet come. Tomorrow I would keep fighting. The winter deepened around me, the cold settling into the cracks of my old apartment building like it was trying to find a way inside my skin. Some nights I would wake with my stitches aching, the scar beneath my ribcage throbbing as if my body wanted to remind me that survival wasn't free, but I kept moving. Kept working the plan. The fundraiser money helped cover the next wave of bills. Dana from the hospital's billing office turned out to be a lifeline. She called me every few days with updates on what she'd managed to reduce, push back, or challenge outright. Every time she shaved off another charge, I felt a piece of the weight slide off my shoulders. At night, when the exhaustion and fear caught up with me, I would lie on my couch, with a heating pad pressed to my side, and watch the snow fall outside my window. Each flake felt like a small promise. The world was still turning, whether my family approved of me or not. One Saturday morning, a knock rattled my door again. For a heartbeat, my chest tightened. I half expected to see Mom and Dad standing there, eyes bright, with fresh guilt and fresh demands. But when I peeked through the peephole, it was my downstairs neighbor, Lena. She held up a brown paper bag. "Breakfast," she said when I opened the door. "I know you've been busy fighting the world, but you still need to eat." I laughed, a sound that cracked something open in me. "Come in." She settled at my kitchen table, unpacking 2 breakfast sandwiches, pastries, and a thermos of coffee. We ate in the quiet companionship of 2 people who had once only exchanged polite hallway hellos. Now she knew more about me than people I'd called family my whole life. "You did the right thing," she said between sips of coffee. "I read every word of what you posted. It was brave." "It felt desperate," I admitted, "but I couldn't keep pretending." Lena's eyes softened. "Sometimes, desperate is just what brave looks like when it's cornered." Her words sank into me like warmth into cold hands. By mid-February, the fundraiser had crossed a threshold I hadn't dared to hope for. Enough to clear out the worst of my balance, enough to buy me some breathing room, until my job's insurance kicked back in. People were still sharing my story, some out of solidarity, some out of disbelief that a family could fracture like this over cake and confetti. One evening Dana called. "I've got good news," she said, her voice bright for the first time in weeks. "The hospital's charity board reviewed your case. Between the errors we flagged and your financial situation, they're forgiving almost 20% of your total." 20%, I repeated, tears springing to my eyes. "Dana, it's not everything," she said gently. "But it's something." It was more than something. It was hope. I stood at my window that night, watching the snow glitter under the streetlights. The shadows of my parents and Celeste flickered across my mind, but they felt distant now, like old ghosts who had lost their grip on my throat. The next day, the ghost knocked. My phone buzzed with a message from Celeste. "Can we talk? Please, I'll come alone." The winter deepened around me, the cold settling into the cracks of my old apartment building like it was trying to find a way inside my skin. Some nights I would wake with my stitches aching, the scar beneath my ribcage throbbing as if my body wanted to remind me that survival wasn't free, but I kept moving. Kept working the plan. The fundraiser money helped cover the next wave of bills. Dana from the hospital's billing office turned out to be a lifeline. She called me every few days with updates on what she'd managed to reduce, push back, or challenge outright. Every time she shaved off another charge, I felt a piece of the weight slide off my shoulders. At night, when the exhaustion and fear caught up with me, I would lie on my couch with the heating pad pressed to my side and watch the snow fall outside my window. Each flake felt like a small promise. The world was still turning, whether my family approved of me or not. One Saturday morning, a knock rattled my door again. For a heartbeat, my chest tightened. I half expected to see Mom and Dad standing there, eyes bright with fresh guilt and fresh demands. But when I peeked through the peephole, it was my downstairs neighbor, Lena. She held up a brown paper bag. "Breakfast," she said when I opened the door. "I know you've been busy fighting the world, but you still need to eat." I laughed, a sound that cracked something open in me. "Come in." She settled at my kitchen table, unpacking 2 breakfast sandwiches, pastries, and a thermos of coffee. We ate in the quiet companionship of 2 people who had once only exchanged polite hallway hellos. Now, she knew more about me than people I'd called family my whole life. "You did the right thing," she said between sips of coffee. "I read every word of what you posted. It was brave." It felt desperate, I admitted, but I couldn't keep pretending. Lena's eyes softened. "Sometimes desperate is just what brave looks like when it's cornered." Her words sank into me like warmth into cold hands. By mid-February, the fundraiser had crossed a threshold I hadn't dared to hope for. Enough to clear out the worst of my balance, enough to buy me some breathing room until my job's insurance kicked back in. People were still sharing my story, some out of solidarity, some out of disbelief that a family could fracture like this over cake and confetti. One evening, Dana called. "I've got good news," she said, her voice bright for the first time in weeks. "The hospital's charity board reviewed your case. Between the errors we flagged and your financial situation, they're forgiving almost 20% of your total." 20%, I repeated, tears springing to my eyes. "Dana, it's not everything," she said gently. "But it's something." It was more than something. It was hope. I stood at my window that night, watching the snow glitter under the streetlights. The shadows of my parents and Celeste flickered across my mind, but they felt distant now, like old ghosts who had lost their grip on my throat. The next day, the ghost knocked. My phone buzzed with a message from Celeste. "Can we talk? Please. I'll come alone. I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed, "Okay. 1 hour. Are column neighbor?" She arrived wrapped in a wool coat, her belly now huge under a knit sweater. She looked tired, beautiful, perfect Celeste, but there was a frayed edge to her smile. I didn't ask her to sit. I leaned against my kitchen counter, arms crossed, waiting. "Margot," she began, "I know you hate me right now, but I need you to listen." "I'm listening." She flinched at my tone but pressed on. "Peter's business is tanking. The house Mom and Dad put up for the mortgage is under review. They could lose everything if you just sign." "Stop," I said sharply. "Don't you dare come in here and ask me to fix this. Not now." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "I don't know what else to do. Peter says we're sunk if you don't." "You made choices, Celeste," I said, my voice rising. "You and them. I begged you to be there when I needed you. You chose brunch and balloons. I survived. And now you want my name on your mess?" "It's not fair," she choked out. "I'm about to have a baby. And I'm about to rebuild my life from the ground up," I snapped. "Do you think you're the only one terrified?" We stared at each other, our mother's eyes staring back at me from her face. For a heartbeat, I saw us as little girls, hiding under the covers, whispering secrets we thought would last forever. She wiped her eyes roughly. "I thought family was supposed to help each other." "So did I said. "But you all taught me something else." Celeste's shoulders sagged. She looked around my tiny kitchen, as if seeing it for the first time. "I wish it didn't have to be like this." "Me too," I whispered. When she left, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. But beneath the hollow, there was something sturdier, a spine I hadn't known I still had. I sat down at my kitchen table, pulled out the last bill I owed, and wrote the check. It wasn't everything, but it was mine. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. To be continued. A week passed after Celeste's visit, but the tension she left behind stayed lodged in my apartment like a splinter I couldn't quite dig out. Every knock at the door made my chest tighten. Every text ping made my stomach clench. But she didn't come back. Not yet. The cold days blurred together. I went back to my editing job part-time, wrapping a scarf around my middle, where my scar still felt tender when I sat too long. The commute was brutal in the icy wind, but the rhythm of work, highlighting, cutting, rearranging other people's messy words helped. It gave me the illusion that if I could fix a paragraph, maybe I could fix my own life too. At night, I would look at my bank balance and the balance sheet Dana had helped me piece together. Every column, every payment plan, every dollar that came in from the fundraiser or my paycheck or an unexpected envelope in the mail, it all felt like tiny bricks. I was stacking to build a wall between me and the abyss they'd left me standing at the edge of. Mom didn't stop calling, neither did Dad. Some days, they switched tactics. Syrupy apologies, then guilt, then veiled threats. You're destroying this family, Margot. Do you want your father to get sick again worrying about this? Your sister's baby will be born into a mess if you don't help. It was the same broken record I'd heard my whole life. If you loved us, you'd fix it. And every time I heard my own voice whisper back, if you loved me, you wouldn't have left. One cold Tuesday, a letter arrived by registered mail. A formal notice from the bank. Celeste and Peter had defaulted on the mortgage payment. Mom and Dad's house was next in line as collateral. They were on the edge of losing everything they'd leveraged for a party I wasn't even invited to. I sat on my couch and stared at the letter until the numbers blurred. My heart twisted. Part of me wanted to throw the door open, run to their house and fix it all. The old Margot would have. The good daughter, the fixer. But the new Margot knew better. The new Margot knew that some things needed to break, so the people who kept demanding sacrifices might finally feel what they'd taken for granted all these years. A few days later, Lena knocked again. She brought lemon muffins and a half bottle of cheap wine. We sat on my floor, our backs against the heater, sharing stories we'd never told anyone else. Do you feel better? She asked at one point, gently picking a crumb off her sweater. Having it all out there? Some days, I said. Other days, I feel like I lit my whole life on fire. She smiled, sad and wise. Maybe that's what it needed. We drank the wine in companionable silence. When she left, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow swirl under the streetlight. Celeste called that night. I almost didn't answer. But some small battered piece of me still needed to hear her voice. Margot, she said, her voice thin and trembling. I just wanted you to know I'm having contractions. They're early. My heart seized. Are you okay? We're at the hospital, she said. Mom and Dad are here, Peter's freaking out. Her breath hitched. I don't know why I called you. I squeezed my eyes shut. You called me because you know I'd care, even if everything else is broken. She started to cry. I don't want to do this without you. I pressed my palm over the scar beneath my ribs, feeling the phantom echo of cold surgical lights and an empty waiting room. You did once, I said, my voice breaking. And so did I. We didn't say goodbye. She hung up when a nurse came in to check her vitals, her sobs echoing faintly in my ear. Hours later, I lay awake, the ceiling cracked with shadows. I imagined her, in that bright hospital room, Mom fussing with her hair, Dad pacing the floor, Peter wringing his hands. I pictured the new baby's first cry, the moment they'd all forget their messes and debts and resentments, at least for a little while. I could have been there. I could have been the good sister again. But I wasn't. I was the sister who survived being left alone. The sister who learned what her love was worth to people who thought her sacrifices were endless. When the dawn finally broke, pale and cold, I felt both heavier and lighter. Maybe that was the price of becoming someone new. Before I fell asleep at last, one thought settled in my chest like a promise. They could beg. They could plead. But I wouldn't carry what wasn't mine anymore. The phone stayed stubbornly silent for 2 days after Celeste's late-night call. I didn't know if I should text her. I didn't know if I wanted to know what had happened. Some part of me felt cruel for staying away, but an even bigger part of me felt raw, like if I stepped back into that hospital for her, I'd be swallowing my own pain just to soothe theirs again. So I waited. I stacked my bills in neat piles on my kitchen table. I answered emails from work. I scribbled more numbers into the battered notebook that had become my ledger of survival. And in the quiet, I felt the old need to be needed, tugging at the edges of my mind. But every time it whispered, I pressed my hand to my scar and reminded myself, not again. On the third morning, I woke to a single text from Celeste. Dinipash baby came early. He's okay. We're okay. No photo, no exclamation marks. Just 3 dry lines that felt heavier than any page-long apology. I read the text over and over, waiting for the resentment to melt. It didn't. It just sank deeper into my chest, like a pebble settling at the bottom of a well. ... Lena found me at the mailboxes that afternoon. She handed me a paper bag with her homemade chicken soup inside. Heard anything? She asked softly. A baby boy, I said, holding the bag tight like it might keep me steady. They're fine. And you? She pressed. I shrugged. Still here. Still paying. Still breathing. She gave my shoulder a squeeze. That's more than enough right now. I carried the soup back upstairs, sat at my tiny kitchen table, and ate every last spoonful alone. Every bite tasted like my own stubbornness and my own freedom. A week later, Mom showed up at my door. I knew she would eventually. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, her hair thrown up in a messy bun, her coat unbuttoned, her eyes dark with sleepless nights. She didn't ask to come in. She just stepped over the threshold, as if the years of habit still gave her permission to cross my boundaries without knocking. He's beautiful, she said. Your nephew. I nodded. I'm sure he is. Mom dropped onto my couch like her bones couldn't hold her up anymore. Celeste wanted you there. She kept asking for you. She didn't want me there when it mattered. I shot back before I could stop myself. You didn't either. She flinched. Margot, you can't keep punishing us for one mistake. I almost laughed. One mistake? Her eyes darted to the stack of bills on my table. You're letting strangers pay for you while your family falls apart. How can you do that to us? I felt my pulse roar in my ears. How could you do what you did to me? You left me. You all left me when I needed you the most. And you want my signature, my money, my silence? She buried her face in her hands. We didn't think. No, I said. You didn't. The room fell silent, except for the hum of my old fridge. I sat across from her, staring at the woman who had once sung lullabies at my bedside. The same woman who had cut my birthday cakes and mended my dresses and told me family came first, right up until it didn't. Margot, she said finally, her voice a rasp. We're losing the house. We're losing everything. If you don't sign then you lose it, I said. My voice didn't shake this time. You lose it, not me. Her head snapped up. How can you say that? You're my daughter. I stood, the ache in my scar, flaring but not stopping me. And I was yours. When it was convenient. I nearly died, Mum. And you went to a baby shower. She gasped, but I kept going. I needed you. I needed Dad. I needed Celeste. And you left. You don't get to ask for more from me. Not now. Tears streamed down her face. We didn't know what to do. We thought you'd forgive us. You thought I'd keep paying, I corrected. That's not the same thing. She rose, swaying on unsteady feet. I don't know who you are anymore. I met her eyes. Neither do I. But I think I like her better. She left then, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click. I waited for the guilt to come roaring back, but it didn't. Not this time. Instead, I felt the smallest flicker of something warm and terrifying. Peace. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my bills one more time. They were smaller now, negotiated, managed, chipped away by the kindness of strangers and my own stubborn fight. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe Celeste would cut me off forever. Maybe Mom and Dad would lose the house. Maybe they'd blame me until their last breath. But I knew one thing. I wouldn't pay the cost for their choices again. My survival was mine to protect now. I turned off my phone, turned out the lights, and lay in bed with the city's muffled hum outside my window. For the first time since the surgery, I slept through the night without dreaming of bright lights and empty chairs. The days that followed were a kind of quiet I'd never known. Not the silence of being left behind. This was something else. This was the hush of a storm finally spent, the sky washed clean but heavy with the memory of thunder. Celeste didn't call. Mom didn't text. Dad didn't show up with containers of lukewarm soup and sad eyes. For the first time in years, my family's drama didn't press against my chest like a vice. And yet in the same breath, their absence throbbed like a phantom limb. I kept working. My editing shifts at the small publishing house picked up again. Each paycheck, modest but steady, felt like a thread I could follow back to myself. At night, I kept the heating pad wrapped around my waist, the scar still tender but no longer raw. My ledger notebook stayed open on the table, new pages filling with scribbled notes, reminders, tiny check marks that said, "You did this, you're doing this." And sometimes, when I was sure no one would see, I cried. Not because I regretted standing my ground, but because it still hurt to know the price of that survival was everything I'd spent my life trying to hold together. One evening in early March, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. But some instinct, soft and curious, made me swipe the screen. "Hello, Margot? It's Dr. Patel's office." The woman on the line spoke briskly, but not unkindly. "We're calling to schedule your 6-month follow-up scan." The words landed in my chest like a cold stone. I'd been so tangled in bills and betrayals that I'd almost forgotten. The story didn't end when I left the operating table. The story was my body now, what it might still be hiding, what might come back. "Right," I said, my throat tight. "Let's book it." When I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. Fear slithered back in, quick and cold. But it didn't find me the same woman it had found 6 months ago. This version of me had survived more than a tumor. She'd survived a family's abandonment, a mountain of debt, and the relentless voice that said she had to fix it all to be loved. No, not anymore. A few days later, Lena knocked again. This time she brought cookies from the corner bakery. We sat on my couch, the smell of sugar and butter cutting through the stale winter air. "When's the follow-up?" she asked gently. "Next week." I picked at a chocolate chip cookie, crumbling it onto a napkin. "They said it's probably fine, but you know. Probably isn't always enough," she nodded. "You want me to go with you?" I laughed softly. "What, and listen to Dr. Patel talk about my insides again?" "I'll bring snacks," she teased. "It'll be like a really terrible girl's day out." For a moment, I imagined it, her in the waiting room, tapping her foot, glaring at anyone who looked at me funny. It made the knot in my chest loosen just a bit. "Okay," I said. "Yeah, I'd like that, That same night, another envelope slipped through my mail slot. I recognized my mother's handwriting instantly, neat, looping, unmistakable. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter, turned on the kettle, made myself a mug of chamomile tea. I sipped it standing up, staring at that white rectangle like it might bite me if I got too close. When I finally tore it open, a single sheet of paper fell out. No letterhead. No legal jargon. Just a few lines in her steady script. "Margot asterisk. We don't know how to fix this. We miss you. We love you. Please come home. Tight." I read it again and again. Please come home. But where was home? A house where my name was just a signature to bail them out? A living room where I'd always be second to confetti and cake? I folded the letter and tucked it into my ledger notebook, between the pages that listed every dollar I still owed. I didn't throw it away. But I didn't answer either. The morning of the follow-up scan, I woke before dawn. Lena showed up right on time, armed with a thermos of coffee and her big rumpled scarf wrapped around her neck twice. "Ready?" she asked. "Not really," I said. But I grabbed my bag anyway. At the hospital, the waiting room was just as cold and bright as I remembered. The scent of antiseptic and cheap soap made my stomach flip. I caught a glimpse of the same hallway where I'd waited for my parents to come back months ago. But this time, I wasn't alone. Lena squeezed my hand. "Whatever they say, you've got this." When they finally called my name, I took one last look at her, sitting there with her crosswords and her travel mug. Then I followed the nurse down that hallway, my pulse loud in my ears, but my steps steady. The week after the scan, I waited for the results the way you wait for a storm that might not come, checking the sky every few minutes, bracing for the sound of thunder that never arrives. Dr. Patel's office said they'd call within 3 days. By the 4th, every ring of my phone made my hands sweat. Lena checked in every night, texting me dumb memes and updates about her cat Finn, who had decided my welcome mat was now his personal throne. Her ordinary chaos grounded me in a way my family's mess never could. On Friday afternoon, the call finally came. I was at work, red penning a draft so riddled with passive voice, I wanted to set it on fire. When my phone lit up with Dr. Patel's name, I ducked into the break room and pressed the phone to my ear like a lifeline. "Margot?" His voice was calm. That helped. "The scan looks good. No sign of recurrence." My knees went weak. I slid down the wall to the cold tile floor, the phone shaking in my hand. So I'm clear, he said. You'll need regular monitoring, but for now you're clear. I let the word echo in my head. Clear. Like a sky washed clean after a hurricane. I thanked him too many times, too fast. When I hung up, I stayed on that floor until my pulse found a rhythm that didn't feel like it would break me open. ... That night, Lena brought over a bottle of cheap champagne and a frozen pizza. We sat on my couch with paper plates balanced on our knees, giggling like teenagers at nothing at all. Clear, she kept saying, raising her glass to clink it against mine. You're clear, Em. I let myself say it out loud, over and over. I'm clear. And under the laughter, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt the smallest sprout of a future I might get to have. One I got to choose for myself. ... On Sunday, my mother's voice slipped back into my life through another envelope. This one didn't come by mail. I found it taped to my door when I got back from a grocery run. The handwriting was shakier this time. Margot *. Your sister's been asking about you. The baby's beautiful. He should know his aunt. We want you to come see him. Maybe we can talk. Please. Love *. Mom, see him. I sat on my welcome mat, Finn the cat sniffing the bag of frozen peas by my feet, and read it 3 times. Maybe we can talk. Maybe. A word that used to mean hope, but now tasted like a trap. ... I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called Dana at the billing office one last time, just to be sure. You're square, she said with a smile I could hear through the phone. You did it, Margot. Did I? The money was sorted, the debts trimmed down to scraps I could handle without signing my life away. The scans were clear. The surgery was a scar, not an open wound anymore, but the family? That ledger was still deep in the red. ... A week later, Celeste called. No text this time, just her voice on the line, raw and uncertain. I want you to meet him, she said. The baby. Peter and I named him Henry, after Grandpa, Henry. The name was a sucker punch, Grandpa's arms lifting me into his garden when I was little, letting me steal strawberries when Mom said no. Love that didn't come with receipts or ultimatums. Margot, Celeste whispered, please, just come. I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. Will Mom and Dad be there? Probably, she admitted, but I'll keep them away if you want. I pictured her standing on her porch, a baby swaddled in her arms. A life that had begun while mine was nearly taken away. I'll think about it, I said. She didn't push. Okay. I hope you do. ... I stayed up all night after that, pacing my apartment like my floorboards might have answers hidden in the cracks. Was forgiveness just another word for forgetting? Or could it be something else? A choice you make so the past doesn't own every inch of your tomorrow? At dawn I stood at my window, the city waking up in a wash of grey light. Henry. Grandpa's name. Grandpa's garden. A promise that love could grow back from ruined ground, if you let it. I still didn't know what I'd say to Celeste when I saw her, or what I'd say to Mom and Dad. But for the first time I felt like I'd get to choose my words. I closed my eyes and pictured the baby's tiny hands, the soft sigh of new life. Maybe. Maybe. To be continued. It took me 3 more days to decide. 3 days of circling my apartment, replaying every word Celeste had said. 3 days of Lena telling me, gently but firmly, whatever you choose, you don't owe them more than you have to give. When I finally said yes, I half expected the sky to fall. But nothing happened. The world kept turning. My scar ached under my sweater, my mailbox filled with grocery coupons and junk flyers instead of demands. Celeste texted me the address, a little starter house on the other side of town. They'd bought it with Peter's parents' help before the mortgage mess. 2 p.m. Just you and me and Henry, she promised. I spent the whole bus ride over staring out the window, counting cracks in the sidewalk, trying not to count the ways this could go wrong. The last time I'd walked into a house with my family in it, I'd left with an empty seat beside my hospital bed. When I knocked, Celeste answered immediately. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled into a limp bun, dark circles under her eyes, a faint stain of something on her shoulder that was probably baby spit up. But her smile was real, if a little fragile. Come in, she said, stepping aside. The house smelled like new paint and stale takeout. Boxes still lined the hallway. A baby blanket draped over the back of the couch. On the coffee table sat a single framed photo of Celeste, Peter, and a red-faced, wriggling Henry. "He's asleep," she whispered, gesturing toward a bassinet by the window. "Want to see him?" I crossed the room slowly, like I might wake him with a single footstep. He was tiny, tiny in the way that makes you want to hold your breath, a soft fuzz of hair, a nose that looked too small for his round cheeks. His tiny fist curled under his chin. "He's beautiful," I murmured. Celeste's shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you." We sat on opposite ends of the couch. Neither of us seemed to know what to do with our hands. "Margot," she said after a moment, "I need to say this. I'm sorry. Not just for the party. For all of it." I watched Henry's chest rise and fall. "Why did you call me when you went into labor?" She blinked. "Because you're my sister." "But you left me," I said softly, each word scraping my throat raw. "You all did." Celeste started to cry then, quietly at first. Then in heaving sobs she tried to swallow back. I know, Margot. I hate it every day. I hate that you were alone. I hate that I let them talk me into believing it was fine." I looked at her. Really looked. My baby sister, who had always been the golden one, the easy one, the one who got the party while I got the knife. "I don't know if I forgive you," I said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever completely." She nodded like she expected that. "Can we still try?" Henry stirred in his sleep, a soft gurgle escaping his tiny lips. I felt something shift in my chest, an old door creaking open just a crack. "We can try," I said. "But I'm not signing anything. I'm not bailing anyone out." Celeste gave a tearful, shaky laugh. "I know, that's not why I wanted you here." She leaned forward, taking my hand in hers. "I want him to know you. I want him to know how strong you are." I squeezed her fingers. "Then you have to show him. You have to show him how to stand up for himself. How to stand up for the people who need him." She nodded. "I will." We sat there in the hush of her living room, Henry's soft breaths the only sound. It wasn't an apology big enough to erase the past. But it was something. A seed. When I finally stood to leave, she hugged me so tight, I felt my stitches ache under my coat. "You're still my sister," she whispered. "Even if you never come back the same." "I won't," I said. "And that's okay." I stepped outside into the brittle March air. The sun had dipped behind the houses, painting the clouds a bruised purple. I took a breath that filled every corner of my lungs. Maybe this was how forgiveness started. Not as a gift to them, but as a freedom for me. I turned my face toward home, my real home, the one I'd built with my own stubborn will and a handful of people who'd chosen me back. I walked away from that little house with my head high. The next few weeks passed in a blur of ordinary things: work, groceries, quiet evenings with Lena and her cat winding around my ankles. Life didn't magically fix itself after that visit to Celeste's house. There was no cinematic moment where Mom and Dad showed up on my doorstep with flowers and tearful apologies. In fact, I didn't hear from them at all. But I didn't crumble. I didn't beg. And the world didn't end. That in itself felt like a kind of miracle. Sometimes Celeste texted me photos of Henry, a squirming bundle of blankets, his tiny fists waving in the air like he was ready to fight the whole world. I'd stare at those photos and feel something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness. Just this slow, quiet hope that maybe he'd grow up learning the difference between love that takes and love that stays. ... On a rainy Wednesday, I found a letter slipped under my door again. No envelope this time. Just a folded page from a legal pad with my father's familiar handwriting. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the rain tapping at my windows, and read it once before setting it aside. "Margot, asterisk. I know you think we're unforgivable, maybe we are. But I miss you. Your mother misses you. We're losing the house. Celeste and Peter are struggling. I don't know what to do. I wish you would come home. Danjashi. ETZ, sir. That day, Quena." There it was again. Come home, like the word meant nothing more than an address, a mortgage, a signature they still hoped I'd give. I closed my eyes and pressed my hand to the faint ridge of my scar. I thought about the weight of hospital lights, the feel of empty air where they should have been. And then I thought of Lena's soup and cheap wine, Dana's tireless calls to the billing office, strangers on the internet who had carried me when my family would not. This was home. My boundaries. My choices. My survival. paid for in ways they'd never understand. I left the letter on my counter. I didn't call, I didn't text. I didn't rush to fix what they'd broken. Not this time. ... A few days later, Celeste invited me back. "Henry's getting so big," she said over the phone, her voice shy and hopeful. "Would you come by? Just for an hour? No one else will be there, I promise." So I went. And when I stepped into her living room, the change nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. She looked tired, yes, but stronger too, more herself. Peter gave me an awkward nod from the kitchen, but he stayed out of the way. It was Celeste who handed me Henry, his tiny weight warm against my chest. "He's so strong," I whispered as he squirmed in my arms. Celeste smiled, like his aunt. For the first time, I believed she meant it. Not as a throwaway line. Not as an apology disguised as praise, but as a promise, an understanding that some family ties could be rewoven, slowly on my terms. We spent an hour on her couch. She asked about my job, my bills, my next checkup. I told her about Lena, about the fundraiser, about the neighbor who kept slipping me $20 bills with post-its that read, "Keep going." Celeste listened. She didn't defend herself. She didn't ask for anything. And when Henry fussed and I handed him back, she didn't beg me to stay longer than I wanted to. "Thank you for coming," she said, standing in the doorway as I slipped my shoes back on. "You didn't have to." "No," I said, "but I wanted to. That's different." She hugged me, gentle this time, no desperate grip, and let me go when I pulled away. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still grey, but there was a warmth in the air that hinted spring was finally pushing through the last of winter. When I got home, Lena was waiting with Chinese takeout and a grin. "How'd it go?" she asked, shoving a carton of noodles into my hands. "It went," I said. "Good. Not perfect, but good." She raised her plastic cup of soda like a toast. "To not perfect. To good enough." I clinked mine against hers, the fist tickling my nose. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation for my choices. For my silence. For the fact that sometimes, forgiveness looked more like distance than a family photo around a dining room table. I had survived them leaving. I had survived paying for what they wouldn't. I had survived my own fear that maybe I couldn't stand alone. Now I was standing, on my own 2 feet. And it was more than enough. Spring crept in quietly that year. One morning, I woke up and the snow was gone from my street, the sidewalks wet but bare, the first pale buds appearing on the tree outside my window. It felt like the world was thawing in step with me. I went back to the hospital one last time for my final post-op check. Lena came with me, reading trashy magazines in the waiting room, while Dr. Patel poked at my scar and ordered one more scan, just to be safe. This time, when he said all clear, I didn't cry. I just smiled wide and real, because survival had stopped feeling like a fight I was losing and started feeling like a life I was winning back. When I got home that day, there was another envelope on my doorstep, my mother's handwriting again. I held it in my hands for a long time before I opened it. I already knew what it would say. "Margot, asterisk. Your father and I are moving in with Peter and Celeste for a while. We've lost the house. I hope one day you'll come see us. Henry keeps asking for you. Well, Celeste does really. We miss you every day. Love, asterisk. Mom's a Tolly." I read it twice. Then I tucked it in the drawer, where I'd kept the hospital bills and all the other ghosts I was done carrying. When Celeste called me that weekend, she didn't beg. She didn't guilt-trip me. She just said, "We're having a little cookout. Just us. No strings. No talk of mortgages. Will you come?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said yes. The backyard was tiny, the grass patchy from the winter. Peter was manning the grill, trying to look casual while burning half the sausages. Celeste was chasing Henry around the patio, his baby squeals mixing with the spring birds overhead. When she saw me standing at the gate, she didn't rush over. She just smiled and waved me in. "Hey, Auntie Margot." Henry wobbled on his unsteady legs, arms reaching. I bent down, letting him grab my fingers. His tiny grip stronger than I expected. Mom and Dad were there too, sitting on mismatched lawn chairs like guests in someone else's life. They watched me, eyes wary but soft. For the first time in my memory, they didn't say anything about paperwork or signatures or sacrifices. They just nodded when I took a seat on the grass beside Henry's blanket. We ate. We talked about nothing important. At one point, Mum brought me a plate of salad, her hands shaking a little as she set it down. "You look good," she said, voice rough. "Strong." "I am," I said. She didn't ask for more. Neither did Dad. Later, when Celeste slipped into the kitchen to wash dishes, I stayed outside with Henry on my lap. He smelled like sunscreen and baby shampoo, a new life that had no idea of the deaths or scars that came before him. I looked up at the sky, clear, open, not a storm cloud in sight, and I thought, this is mine too. Not the guilt, not the endless ledger of what I owe, but this moment, this quiet peace. The choice to stay for the people who try, who might never be perfect but were learning inch by inch how to stand beside me instead of on me. When I left, I hugged Celeste tight, whispered in her ear, "Take care of him better than we were taken care of?" She nodded against my shoulder. "I will." I walked home in the dusk, the world soft and green around me, the last shreds of winter finally giving way. I thought about the hospital lights, the confetti, the lonely waiting room, the long empty nights, and I thought about this, that I'd survived all of it. That I'd learned how to say no and mean it, how to let go without closing my heart completely. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.